University suggests, I'm here to share some information that may not be readily available to the general public. The life of Malcolm X is quite misunderstood. In some quarters, he's still a controversial figure, but he has risen in stature and in acclaim, and his light is shining ever so bright these days with all of these documentaries and cultural productions around his name and his legacy. And I'm just here today to share his life with the students and the university community here at Redlands, and also to interpret him and to make clear some things about his life that may be misunderstood. And in particular, I'm here to talk about our 6-part Netflix series, Who Killed Malcolm X, which has been nominated for an Emmy Award and is responsible, universally regarded as the most important work to contribute to the exoneration of 2 innocent men who were wrongfully convicted for his assassination 55 years ago.
I just had a basic general question, like what was it like filming a Netflix documentary? Because I realized the camera was always on you, and you were one of the main persons in that documentary, and you were going out and meeting new people instead of just the camera was always on you. Like, how was that experience for you?
Well, for me, it was more so the work and focusing on the interviews and trying to capture on film the critical information that would make it impactful and informative. And so that kind of distracted me from all the mechanics around the production of it. So it was quite easy for me.
Mm. And yeah, so I had a question. I completely agree with you. I believe that Malcolm X his life is just very complex, and I feel like the media and especially the school system has portrayed him as like a bad guy, and especially in comparison to Martin Luther King Jr. So can you just talk a little bit more about that, and like why you believe he has been portrayed as the bad guy?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm going to deal with that a little bit tonight. Martin Luther King was viewed as a respectable Negro leader. He was from the black middle class. He came from a very comfortable background. His father was a college man and an acclaimed preacher, right? And so he didn't go through the privations and the struggles that a Malcolm X went through. His life, he didn't, even during the Depression, he still lived a very comfortable life, went to some of the finest schools. By the time he was, in his mid-20s, had attained a PhD, right? And so he was viewed as a moral voice, representing Christianity, representing love, nonviolence. Whereas Malcolm represented another strain of African American thought, a more pessimistic strain of thought, which said that, America is irredeemably racist, and that being the case, it's impossible for us to integrate into the society. We'll never be allowed to be equal in America due to the system of white supremacy and racial oppression and the attitudes, the anti-black attitudes that pervaded society at that time. And that that was always a smaller segment of the black community, but it's always been there, and it's been very potent. And Malcolm articulated that strain of black thought and that wasn't popular. And he represented an ideology for many years, 12 years, that was seen as the very antithesis of what Dr. King represented. And in many ways it was, and there was a anti-white aspect to that ideology. And so for that reason, he was always demonized as a hate monger, as a demagogue. However legitimate his critique of white racial oppression in this country was, later on he's going to repudiate some of his more obnoxious views while retain the militancy and the right to defend ourselves, against extrajudicial violence, let's say from the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and these other white hate groups. And anytime, you stand up and you say we have a right to own guns, we have a Second Amendment, we have all of these types of things, this scares people. And it's for that reason that he was misunderstood in his lifetime. Since then, 1999, he has been put on a U.S. stamp. So you have to be a good American, right, to get that honor. So we see him now, in a different light so many years later.
What got you involved in researching the life of Malcolm X, and what kept you researching?
Well, he had a huge impact on my life because when I was coming up, it was not unusual for a police department to be, if not totally white, almost totally white. And it was not unusual for black youth at that time to experience harassment and abuse by the police. Police would just round you up for any reason, trump up charges on you, or beat you, and all kinds of things like this. And this was a very, very common thing. And that unfortunately happened to me when I was about 14 years old, all because I happened to be standing a little too close to a white girl, who was the girlfriend of my cousin, okay? And that traumatized me, and it radicalized me, and it changed me, really. It filled me with anger and rage, and it was not long after that, in high school, where a friend of mine was in the laboratory, and he had a cassette player, and he was playing a cassette of one of Malcolm X's speeches, and I had never heard him before. I was a young kid, and as soon as I heard it, I said, "Who is that? Who is that?" Because it spoke directly to what had happened to me, And from that day, really, I've been committed to him and tried to learn as much as I could about his life and to even follow in his footsteps in many ways, because I myself became a Muslim under his influence and his legacy. So it's been a lifelong journey. And I don't think I'm through yet. Still studying, still learning, and still sharing, which is why I'm here today at Redlands this week.
Mm-hmm. And why did Malcolm's X, his death, didn't sit right with you? Why have you spent 30 plus years dedicating your life to figuring out what really happened?
Because it was one of those things where it had to be resolved. It was an open wound in the community, and there was always a dark shadow that was cast over that. There was a veil over it, and we didn't really have clarity about what happened. The trial of the convicted assassins in 1966 was never accepted by historians and journalists and researchers. It was always known that there were shenanigans involved in that trial. And when I came along around 1980 or so, many years ago, I was exposed to it from a show that was airing on our television station at Howard University.
HU.
You know.
Yes, sir.
One of the convicted assassins, who was a real assassin. As we know now, 2 of the 3 men were wrongfully convicted. But the man who owned up to his role in the killing, one of the shooters, his name was Talmadge Hayer. He fired the .45. He, again, was doing television interviews whereby he was trying to exonerate his 2 co-defendants. And that's when I first got exposed to the injustice around the trial, and that there were 4 men who were never charged, who were still walking the streets, of Newark, New Jersey, unaccosted, unmolested. And it bothered me that no one was really trying to address that. And at first, as a young person, what can you do? You really can't do anything. I was a student, I was a kid, but it nagged at me, and and later, say around the mid-'80s, starting around 1986 or whatever, when I became a Muslim and was a member of the community, and I began to hear things and I began to learn things, that's kind of like when I started collecting little nuggets related to the case. And sometimes things moved along pretty quick, and sometimes things slowed down. You know what I mean? It wasn't like this is what I did for a living or anything like that. It was all funded out of my pocket, and these kind of things take a long time. And also there was an element of danger around this case, because the way that Malcolm X was assassinated so brazenly, so cold-bloodedly, in broad daylight, in front of 400 people, with his pregnant wife, who was carrying twins at that time, and his 4 baby girls, right there, it sent a loud and clear message, right, that if we could do this to Malcolm X, right, what could we do to you? Leave it alone. It's none of your business. And it's one of the things you'll constantly hear in the Netflix series. Leave it alone. Don't go there. Let sleeping dogs lie. And that's really what I was up against all these years. So I had to be very careful and circumspect in the way I did my research, in the way I interviewed people, to protect myself.
Yeah, no direct questions.
Yep. Be very, broad with the questions, and just let people talk. 98% of what they tell you is of no use to you. The other 2% is gold. And that's how I did it. It's painstaking, and it takes a long time, because you can see these people really don't want to talk. And if you ask them directly about it, then red flags are going to go off all over the place, because it's a very, very sensitive issue. Very sensitive, because you've got killers walking around, and they're actually part of the community. One of the brothers in the series, his name is Qasim Nathari. He's an elder in the Muslim community in Newark. He described it as the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We didn't discuss that.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about the dynamic, or like the relationship between the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, and how it changed, and how it changed?
Yes, it was very good until it went bad. And Malcolm X was a loyal soldier in the Nation of Islam, right? He was its chief architect. When he left prison in 1952, as a member of the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam only had about 400 or 500 people nationwide. It only had about 6 temples. Detroit, Michigan, where the movement began, Chicago, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. There were other study groups, right, and little groups around the country, but it was very, very difficult in these more urbane northern cities to actually establish what they called temples at that time. But when Malcolm went to work, within a very short period of time, he had grown the nation, to tens of thousands of people. By 1961, I saw an FBI document where he was having a meeting with the Ku Klux Klan, which is another story. And one of the not so, flattering things about his career, okay? But there's an FBI document where he gave a number of 175,000 people, okay? And this is around 1961, if memory serves me correctly. So he put the Nation of Islam on the map. And he had a relationship with the leader, Elijah Muhammad, that was like a father and a son. But this generated hatred and jealousy amongst Elijah Muhammad's own children, because he treated Malcolm better than he treated his own children.
Really?
Yes. Malcolm could walk right up to the house and walk right in the house. The other children his real children were kind of dim-witted. You know what I mean? It was slow. They drove taxis and they worked in factories, and it's Malcolm who picked up a special collection amongst the following so that Elijah Muhammad's children could work full-time for the movement. So he put them on, right? And he, in a sense, created the monster that would come back and get him, He created a cult around the family. He called them the royal family and all of this. And he put an aura of, divine favor around them, right? Where they almost became like untouchable. But they were corrupt. And they used the Nation of Islam as their own personal ATM machine. They didn't really believe in the doctrine or that their father was any type of divine messenger and all of that jazz. They didn't believe any of that. It was just, they loved the money flowing in from their businesses, from their newspaper, and it was Malcolm, who was doing all the grunt work, growing the nation and that. And then so what happened is Malcolm became disillusioned because he started to notice that the rhetoric of the nation didn't match their actions. Right? For example, he criticized quite harshly the civil rights leaders at that time: Dr. Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, and all of these people. And he called them handkerchief head, Uncle Toms. Mm-hmm. He called them traitors to the race for preaching nonviolence. He said, we Muslims, we're not nonviolent. We're not Christians. We're not turning any cheeks, right? We're taught to obey the law, be respectful, be peaceful. But if anyone puts their hand on you, you send them to the cemetery. Okay? And so he made a distinction between the Nation of Islam and the Civil Rights Movement. If you see the Nation of Islam, images of them, they're very militant and very angry, and they look like they're ready to take care of business, right? Mm. But they didn't. You see, they didn't. And this became clear to Malcolm when their mosque was violated by the police in Los Angeles in April of 1962, April 27th, mosque number 27. So it was the same date as the number of the mosque was the same date, April 27th, 1962. There was a police shootout at their mosque where the secretary of the mosque, who was a friend of Malcolm from Boston days, was murdered. His name was Ronald Stokes. He was killed by the police, and they, completely violated their house of worship, which to Malcolm was like an act of war. And he was ready now, to bring the smoke to the police. Okay, this is what we've been training for, right? We practice karate, and we practice this discipline, and they had like a paramilitary, the Fruit of Islam, whatever. And Malcolm believed that one day we would have to go to work and put that work in. And the way he looked at it is, this was such a violation that it called for us to go and retaliate against the police. And Elijah Muhammad was having none of that. He completely vetoed it. And not only did he veto that type of action, but he told Malcolm that Brother Ronald, the secretary who got killed, he got killed because he didn't have enough faith. Yeah, because Ronald raised his hands, and he raised his hands, and he said, I'm not trying to harm anyone. And the police officer shot him right through the heart. So Elijah Muhammad said, hey, I don't teach you to raise your hands and let the devil come into our temples. So Brother Ronald died because it was his own fault. And Malcolm couldn't make sense of that, right? What are we doing here, right? What is this all about, right? Because we're training, we're organizing. We are the army of black people, okay? And you taught us, anyone put their hands on us, we're supposed to go to war to defend our community. And when that didn't happen, and he saw the contradiction between the rhetoric and what they actually did, which was nothing. Now, we can argue whether that was the right thing to do. I'm not arguing that point. I'm trying to give you Malcolm's perspective on it. Not only that, but the crass way that the Nation of Islam exploited that tragedy. They started selling more newspapers, so they were generating more money off the death of Ronald Stokes. They were exploiting it. So Elijah Muhammad told Malcolm, I know you want to fight the devil. And by the devil, they meant white people. White people were believed to be the devil, right? I know you want to fight the devil. But we are going to fight the devil. But we're not going to fight him in the way that you want to fight him. We're going to fight him by educating and raising up more of our people. So instead of taking 100 newspapers to sell, now you take 200 newspapers to sell. So they exploited the death to generate money. So this contradiction awakened in Malcolm the other contradictions that were lingering in the back of his mind, because he had heard, going all the way back to the 50s, that Elijah Muhammad was not all that he was cracked up to be. That he had heard stories about illicit relationships that he was having with his secretaries, who were very young, late teens or early 20s. And Malcolm, over the years, had kind of put that out of his mind. You can't allow yourself to go there, right? It's like if you suspect that your boyfriend or your girlfriend is cheating on you, but you really love them, so you don't deal with it, right? You go into denial.
Yeah.
But then you see something, right, that makes you question it, and now you have to follow up on it. Well, that's what happened with Malcolm, and then he got confirmation of that. So those two things, the moral corruption and also the failure of the Nation of Islam to take any kind of action during this time when the civil rights leaders, for all of his criticism of them, they were making gains. They were making gains through the sit-ins, through the freedom rides, right? The Montgomery bus boycott, going back to 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, and slowly and gradually they were making gains. while the Nation of Islam was sitting off on the side, right? Posturing and stunting and fronting like they were so militant. But what were they really doing? Even when their own mosque was attacked, they did nothing. And this embarrassed Malcolm, and it bothered him, you know. And ultimately, that's where the break is going to, that's where things started to go bad.
Yeah, and so leading up with that, do you believe that when Malcolm X was separated from the Nation of Islam, do you believe that played a role to, like, the reason why the assassins killed Malcolm X?
Yes, well, here's what happened. When he first broke, because remember, in November 1963, November 22nd, the nation experienced a catastrophic trauma, which was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who was a beloved president, very young, very handsome. He had a beautiful wife. He had gorgeous children. His administration was called Camelot, okay? And America loved John Kennedy, and black people in particular loved John Kennedy, and they felt that he was on their side, right, to press for civil rights and what have you. So an order was sent out in the nation to tell all of the ministers, do not say anything about the death of President Kennedy. Do not do that. I'm ordering you not to do that, right? Now, December 1st, the new month, December 1st, 1963, Malcolm gave a speech at the Manhattan Center, which is about a block from Penn Station, Madison Square Garden. And it's a hall there, right? Elijah Muhammad was supposed to be the speaker, but he couldn't make it. So Malcolm said, look, since we already paid for the hall, I'll speak there for you. Okay. But again, he wasn't supposed to say anything about the president. And in his speech, he did not. The name of the speech was a typical Nation of Islam speech. It was called God's Judgment on America. However, in the question and answer period, someone asked him about the death of President Kennedy. And, you know, he gave a bad answer. He said, he gave an answer that he believed in, right? They taught that all white people were the devil, right? So the president of the United States must be the chief devil, okay? And so Malcolm, you know, regularly attacked President Kennedy. So in his view, he didn't want to play the politics. Okay, we're going to say what we always say. And his answer went like this. He said, you know, as an old farm boy, chickens coming home to roost never made me sad. They always made me glad. Right? And then he went on to explain what he meant. Like, America has been involved in all these coups, right? And meddling in the foreign affairs of other nations, overthrowing governments, orchestrating coups and all of that. The death, or the murder, I should say, of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, what they were doing in Vietnam. So he said all of that negative energy that our government sent out in the world is coming back to roost. And it manifested itself in the death of President Kennedy. Well, you know, the media took that and exploited it, and they made it like Malcolm was gloating over the death of this beloved president. So the next day, Elijah Muhammad suspended Malcolm from speaking publicly for 3 months. And Malcolm took his medicine. You know, he said, you're right. Dear Holy Apostle, I shouldn't have said that. He was very humble and contrite, and he took it. However, over the course of those 3 months, there was a propaganda campaign within the nation that was coming from the national leadership, because he couldn't speak to defend himself now, right? So this gave the opportunity for his enemies, Elijah Muhammad's jealous children, right? Those officials who were getting rich off the back of the following, right? Who didn't understand that this was really like a racket, right? They started propagandizing the flock that Malcolm was scandalizing the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that Malcolm was putting his personal business in the street, talking about the children and all of that. And he couldn't defend himself. And when it became clear that he was never going to get back in the nation, and that in fact they were really trying to kill him, one of the followers, a man named Luqman, who I interviewed about 5 or 6 years before his death, they sent to wire Malcolm's car with an explosive. Okay? And with all of that, after he broke on March 8th, 1964, after he broke with the nation, he still tried to extend the olive branch, you know what I mean? Tried to give Elijah Muhammad his due. He's the man who raised me up. He's the man who taught me everything I knew. But they still wouldn't leave him alone. So he went to Mecca in April of 1964, April 13th, and he came back May 1st. He made his Hajj and performed all the rituals, and then he went to a number of African countries, right? To Egypt, he went to Ghana, Nigeria. He went to Beirut, Lebanon, so on, Algeria. When he came back, that's when it hit the fan, because the nation was putting him out of his house, right? Even though technically the nation owned the house, Elijah Muhammad had promised him that house. And Malcolm, for whatever reason, you know, blind trust and devotion, he wouldn't put his name on the deed. So when it went bad, they took the house back. And it got really nasty, and ultimately Malcolm went public with Elijah Muhammad's children and his illicit relationships and all of that. And that's really when, you know, that was the point of no return, right? That's when the hit squads were organized against him. And from that point on to the end of his life, they hounded him, they hunted him down like a dog. He went back to Africa in July of 64, and he stayed over there a long time. He didn't come back till the end of November 24th. So for the 11 months and a couple of weeks or so that he left the nation, half of that he was out of the country. He was out of the country. And it was during that time that they were organizing all over the country squads to take him out.
What is the most surprising thing you've learned about his life through your research?
That is a good question. Not surprised so much as insight into the man's sincerity. He was a very sincere man, you know, and towards the end of his life, he admitted that, you know, he was wrong about certain things, right? Branding the entire white race as the incarnation of Satan, you know what I mean? That's wrong, you know. But he said, if I'm to be remembered for anything, I want to be remembered for my sincerity. That even when I was wrong, I was sincerely wrong. And now that I've repudiated those beliefs, right, I want you to know that I sincerely will try to make amends for that. You know, and that's hard to do. That's hard to do. It's hard for people who are on that kind of platform to admit they're wrong. When do you ever see politicians admit that they're wrong? You know, they'll just keep it pushing, right? They'll just get a new position and act like they didn't have the old position, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not what he did, and he was a genuine guy. He was a good man, and he was a misunderstood man, and he did a good work, and he left a great legacy, and we needed him. The civil rights movement needed him, because without the militant voice of a Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam when he represented it, right, Dr. King and the civil rights leaders wouldn't have had the kind of leverage to get from the government what they were seeking, which was, ultimately, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's what I would say I've really learned from him, is to be humble and to be sincere and not afraid to change your mind when you realize that you're wrong. That's a great quality to have as a human being, and to take ownership of your life and not make an excuse for your life. That to me, I think, is a very, very important lesson that we can gain from the Malcolm X story.
I love that.
Yeah,
I had a question. This is my last question about his death. Can you talk a little bit about how his death addressed the issues or the injustices of the criminal justice system?
Well, that's a big question.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you talk about the criminal justice system, you're not just talking about, municipal police departments, but you're also talking about bureaus like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. That's the criminal justice system as well. They're the federal police. And at that time, the FBI was led by a universally despised individual by the name of J. Edgar Hoover, who routinely violated the rights of so many Americans in the activist community and invaded their privacy, put wiretaps on their phone, infiltrated their organizations with informants and agent provocateurs. And even in the case of, let's say, the Black Panthers after Malcolm, orchestrated the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, the Chicago Panthers, there who were doing good work and very young, 21 years old. They had an informant who made a map of the house, and they gunned him down in his sleep. Okay, so this is what the things that our government did. And the families of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark they sued the government for murder, and they won. Now, in the case of Malcolm X, we don't have that kind of smoking gun, but we do know that J. Edgar Hoover was, of course, spying on Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, that he had informants who were stoking hatred and vitriol against Malcolm, right? Creating suspicion against him, against Elijah, against the nation, right? Dirty tricks, making phone calls. Okay, hey, you better watch out. This one's coming to get you, right? They were planting stories, false stories in the newspaper to try to create jealousy against Malcolm, like he was hungry for leadership, like he was the number 2 man, or he was the heir apparent. This would drive the leadership in the Nation of Islam crazy, because they didn't want Malcolm to be the leader if the old man died. They wanted it to be someone from the family, you see? So this is what the government did. And to the extent that we know that they did that, as far as I'm concerned, they had a hand and they had a role in the assassination of Malcolm X. If they were not the actual shooters, And also you'll learn from our series that very soon after his murder, they knew, right? They knew. They had a very strong suspect, and by that summer, August of 1965, they actually knew who did it, and they never turned him over to the prosecution. All right, they allowed 2 innocent men who weren't even in the Audubon ballroom that afternoon to go to prison for over 20 years for a crime that they knew they did not commit. So you talk about the criminal justice system. To me, that is pure, unadulterated, unmitigated racism. To just say, look, we need to close this case. Just grab or swoop up somebody, put a case on them, let's shut this down. And in the series, you'll see how nonchalant the white police officer and the assistant DA were, in talking about the assassination.
Do you believe he fulfilled his purpose?
I do feel he fulfilled his purpose. I believe that, death is written. And he believed that as well. He believed in the Muslim belief of predestination, that that there's a certain path that we're placed on, and there's a certain mission that every human being has in life. I think about this now, like how out of 300 and 30 million people in America, how come I'm the one, right, that revealed this killer? How did that happen? How did that happen that, some work that I did contributed to the exoneration of 2 innocent men, right, to where I can come today and speak all over the country, right? How did that happen? It's certainly nothing that I planned. I couldn't even conceive of it when I was your age, because there was no Netflix. There was no internet. There were no smartphones. There were no PDF files. There was none of that, right? The most that I could have expected was maybe get a segment on 60 Minutes or 2020 or something like that, right? So there is a destiny that we all have to fulfill. So I believe that, yes, he did fulfill his mission, because we're taught in Islam that the death of the human being is not the death of their work. And the proof of that is, if you look over the last couple of years, right, the cultural production related to Malcolm X is really more than Martin Luther King, right? You have our series, Who Killed Malcolm X? You have One Night in Miami, right? You had Blood Brothers, the story of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. You had the PBS 4-part series on Muhammad Ali, which featured Malcolm X very prominently. You've had 2 Pulitzer Prize winning books that have come out. That came out years ago, but one this past year by Les Payne, who you'll see tonight, his daughter, who appeared in the ABC special Exonerated. That's on Hulu. So it goes on and on and on. A book on his mother, The Life of Louise Norton Little, where you have a lot of new information about her. It's incredible, So his life is, I would say, in this hour, in this moment, post George Floyd, his life is more impactful than it was in his own lifetime. He didn't receive this kind of acclaim in his lifetime, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. His death was just seen as a tragic case of, black on black crime. It's too bad.
He had it coming for him.
He had it. Well, he preached violence, so, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, and that's kind of how it was treated, and not much was said about it after that. And but look at him today. We're still talking about him, and he still inspires us. So it's yes, he fulfilled his mission. I'm confident of that.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Muhammad, for coming and talking with us. Is there one last message you would like to tell our University of Redlands students?
Yes, I would like to say that in life, you don't know what you don't know, right? And we all come from different backgrounds and perspectives. And I'm here to represent diversity, you know. And like I say, Malcolm X is misunderstood. And he's a great man. And I would say that if you don't know anything about him, this summer, when you have some time, read his book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, that was written with the author of Roots, Alex Haley. And I guarantee you, you will learn the history of this country, the history of race relations in this country. It's a powerful, redemptive story. And you will see the sincerity of this man's heart in this book. And I guarantee you, you will not be able to put it down. I want you to enrich your life. And, you know, perhaps before I came, you didn't know anything about Malcolm X. But I'd like you to, you know, be enriched by your educational experience. And I'm going to suggest this book to you. And I'll leave you with that.